That's weird.
Are you connected?
Reconnect, let's see. Huh?
You connected on the
Probably not.
Live a little bit closer.
You're live.
It's not much live.
Okay, you're live.
عايز اللايف come closer.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله. Technical difficulties. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Dear listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We start off by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and sending peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and his companions until the last day. So we're continuing on the series of the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Seerah of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Who remembers where we left off last? So last session we talked about the first profession of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he was a shepherd and he took care of sheep. In fact, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions in a hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not sent a prophet except that they were shepherds, and they were shepherds of sheep. And then the Sahaba, the companions, they asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "O Prophet of Allah, what about you?" And he said, "Yes, I used to herd the sheep with compensation from the people of Mecca." We also went on to mention in the last session some of the wisdoms behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made all the prophets go through this role of being a shepherd. And it's striking that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he trained all of his anbiya by going through this line of work. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, he could have given the anbiya, the prophets, a life of luxury. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, he could have given the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam an easy life. And we mentioned that one of the most important lessons that the Anbiya learned and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam learned by going through this line of work was responsibility. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentions in a hadith that you are all shepherds and you are responsible for your herds. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in this hadith, he goes on to say that the leader of the people is a guardian and he's responsible for his subjects. Then the Prophet ﷺ, he talks about the man, that he's responsible for his household. And then he talks about the woman. The woman is the guardian of her husband's home and his children, and she is responsible for them. And then the Prophet ﷺ goes further. The servant of a man is the guardian of the property of his master, and he is responsible for it. No doubt every one of you is a shepherd and is responsible for his flock. And if you remember, in the last session we explored this in further detail, and we said that whatever line of work in, you are a shepherd, you have a responsibility. Even in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't leave out the servant. He said the servant is responsible for the task of looking after the property of his master, and he is responsible for it. So you can't give an excuse and say, I'm not a manager, I'm not a leader, I don't have a high position in society. No, whatever position you hold, you have a responsibility for that position. And amongst the wisdoms, we mentioned that the Anbiya alayhi salam, they learnt about responsibility, they learnt about being patient with these soft creatures, they learnt about protecting these soft creatures because they will be protecting the ummah from the shaitan. And it also brought out a simplicity in their lifestyle. So as we're continuing with the series of the time when the Prophet ﷺ was a young boy, there's one there's one story which is mentioned about the Prophet ﷺ meeting a monk while he was on a journey to Syria. And this is known as the story of Bahira the monk. Now, hadith experts and Seerah scholars, they have mixed views regarding this narration. Some of the scholars have said that it's okay to mention this story. Others have said that this is not established. So inshallah, what we're going to do today is we're going to go through some of the high level detail of this story, and then we will analyze the information that we have in front of us. So this story is actually mentioned in one of the books of hadith. It's mentioned in Sunan at-Tirmidhi. And it's mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he went on a trade journey to Syria with his uncle Abu Talib. And at the time, the Prophet ﷺ, he was a young boy. He had not matured, meaning he was at the age of around 11 or 12. And we mentioned in a previous session, there was one person in the Quraysh who was related to the Prophet ﷺ, and he introduced this concept of the trade caravan, رحلة الشتاء والصيف, that in the winter they used to take a trade caravan to Yemen and down south, and then in the summer up north to Syria and Rome. So who was the person? Can anybody remember? Hashim, the great-grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ, he introduced this to the Quraysh. So the Prophet ﷺ here, as a young boy, is accompanying Abu Talib to Syria on a trade caravan. And we mentioned this story is mentioned in Sunan at-Tirmidhi. Now a point to note.
I'm using the wrong battery. It's running out, so sorry.
Okay.
Like a backup.
It's fine, yeah? It's recorded the...
Yeah, no way. Starting.
This is good justification for new equipment, eh? For the listeners online, we're just experiencing some technical difficulties.
Keep going with the dead one. The compatible one doesn't want to work.
Can you also check the statuses of the people live online just to make sure that they're up?
It's only one connected.
Okay.
So either you go ahead and we just capture this, you know.
Okay.
And this may die at any time.
That's
yeah?
fine.
Okay. Oh, it's all showing error, even this. Yeah? Even this. It's probably not case.
Try and reset it. And
It's just on off. Yeah? It's nothing, it's just a battery. Yeah. Open failure doesn't show failure. It has reached the end of life. Yeah? Both of them are working. Oh. So maybe you can carry on.
okay, khair, inshallah. What we're focusing on is that this story is mentioned in a book of hadith, which is Sunan at-Tirmidhi. But a point to note is that most of the seerah, whenever we learn about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, most of the seerah, the life of the Prophet ﷺ, is not mentioned in the hadith books. It is mentioned in the books of seerah. When we say the books of seerah, what do we mean? Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'ad. So these are the books of seerah. And then we have the hadith books, right? We have authentic hadith. So the level of authenticity in seerah books is 1 degree lower than the hadith books. We know the hadith books are Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Ibn Nasa'i, Sunan Abi Dawood, Sunan Ibn Majah, Sunan At-Tirmidhi. We have the Musnad of Imam, the Muwatta of Imam Ibn Malik, and we have the Sunan of Dayrami. So these books are the books that are known as the Ummahat, the mother books. Our religion after the Quran is based on them. Our theology, our aqidah, our ethics, our fiqh, our laws and legislations. So these are the books which are the authentic books. And then after this we have the books of Seerah. Now a distinction here, the scholars have said that we can, although there is in some of these stories of the Seerah, we can accept them.
It's mark, yeah. So
It's
if you want
where?
to repeat, it's fine. It's up to you. Just mark.
We'll catch up later on, inshallah.
Yeah. You want to repeat or you can take
No, it's
from-
fine. We just
It's fine,
continue.
yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, just give me time. Just 30 seconds.
You carry on, inshallah, no problem.
Yeah, okay.
So the Seerah is focusing on historical details. So the scholars, they say that the Seerah is not actually focusing on what is halal, what is haram, what is permissible, what is impermissible. No, this is focusing on historical detail. Where and on the flip side, we have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ is giving us a command, an address, an instruction. So, however, there are some stories in the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ where, and we need to analyze some of the events which take place from an academic perspective and critical analysis and critical thinking. And the story of the monk, the Bahira the monk, is one of these stories. Now, you guys may remember in one of the earlier sessions, we mentioned a narration which is quite famous about Umar ibn al-Khattab and the fact that he recalled a situation where he buried his young daughter alive, and he was upset during that time. And when we started doing the critical thinking around this, we started to analyze that, yes, this was a Jahili concept, that people used to bury their daughters alive, but it was not the practice of his tribe. And then Umar ibn al-Khattab, he already had a daughter pre-prophethood. Before the Prophet ﷺ became a prophet of Allah, he already had a daughter by the name Hafsa. And if he was in the practice of killing his daughters, then why did he not bury his eldest daughter Hafsa alive? And also the time when he showed softness towards Abdullah bint Hutmah, that she was leaving Mecca at the time. And he asked her that, are you leaving Mecca? And she said, yes, because your people have treated us harshly. So he said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be with you. And this is the time when she went to her husband and she said, you know, Umar, he spoke to me so softly in such a calm tone. And he said, what, do you think Umar is going to be Muslim? He's not going to be Muslim. He's got such a hard heart that his donkey would become Muslim before he does. Meaning that there's no chance. And even from this we learn a story that whenever Allah wills guidance for someone, He facilitates the means for His guidance. And even if that person has the hardest heart on earth and is the furthest away from Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring that person towards Islam. So this is a lesson for us in da'wah as well. That regardless of, sometimes we may have a perception that this person, he's a hater of Islam. How is this person ever going to become Muslim? No, rather our job is to propagate the deen, to talk about the deen, and leave guidance in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So coming back to the story, Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was 11 or 12 years at the time, and he had not reached the age of puberty. And it's recorded in Sunan At-Tirmidhi that he was with Abu Talib on this trade caravan to Syria, and he was in the company of Abu Bakr Siddiq and Bilal radiallahu an. Now, on the way to Syria, they passed a place which was a monastery. And Bahira the monk, he used to live there. But this monk, he didn't used to like the pagan Arabs because he was a religious person. And he thought these people, they're pagans. He never used to give them the time of day. But on this specific journey, not only did he come out in search of them, he came out, he greeted them, and he also invited them back to his place for a feast. So can you imagine this trade caravan? What must they be thinking? This old man, He doesn't give us the time of day, and today he's coming out to, invite us for a feast. What's going on? They must be shocked. What happens when a husband buys some flowers for the missus? She gets shocked, right? What have you done wrong today? So similarly, they're in a state of shock, right? That all this time, he didn't want to know us, and now he wants to know us. So they asked him, they inquired, that why are you inviting us? What is this pleasant behavior that you have towards us today? And he said, in your midst, in your group, you have a young boy who is going to become a prophet of Allah. And they asked him that, how do you know? And he said, as you guys were traveling, I realized that the clouds were sheltering him, and when you stopped and you were resting near trees, the trees were sheltering him, and also the stones, they prostrated to him. And it's mentioned in the narrations that during the time they were having the feast, there were 7 Roman soldiers that came looking for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They wanted to find who this boy was, and they wanted to kill him. So Bahira, during this time, he hid the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said to the Romans that there's nobody here. After this, the Bahira, he tells Abu Talib that I fear for your nephew. You need to take him back to Mecca and make sure he's in your protection. So the story continues that Abu Talib gave the instruction to Abu Bakr Siddiq and Bilal radiallahu an to take the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam back to Mecca. Now, this story, we mentioned that there's a difference of opinion from scholars. Some of the scholars like At-Tirmidhi, Ibn Hajar, and Al-Hakim, the big scholars, they've said that this is a story which is okay to narrate. But some of the other scholars like Al-Dhahabi, they have critical thinking. Ibn Kathir, they say that there's something wrong about this story. So I want to kind of give you some of the responses of Imam Al-Dhahabi. He was a great historian of the 7th century and a student of Ibn Taymiyyah. So Al-Dhahabi, Imam Al-Dhahabi, he was actually a scholar who was a critical thinker. So you don't accept something just at face value, right? And we see this time and time again. The Quraysh in Mecca, and even at the time of Ebrahim alayhi salam, when he asked the pagans that why are you worshipping idols? What did they say? We found our forefathers worshipping them, right? You follow and you obey. You listen, you hear and obey, as they say. So a person who is a critical thinker doesn't just hear and obey. They ask questions, they think, they analyze, they compare. So we see here that Al-Dhahabi is starting to think critically. And this is the hallmark or sign of an academic, that you don't just accept everything you hear. You look at the information at hand, you study it, you research, you analyze, you compare, you think, you comprehend. And even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about the Quran. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ, that when you look at the Quran, do you not ponder and reflect over the Quran? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجِدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا, that if it had been from anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there would have been in it much contradiction. There would have been in it many mistakes. So this is the book from the Creator. This is why it's error-free. And it doesn't matter what angle you look at the Quran. You cannot find fault in it. This is because it is from the Creator. And it reminds me of, in fact, a person who became Muslim just by reviewing Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And this was a non-Muslim. He started to read the Quran, and he gets to the 2nd chapter of the Quran, and he starts reading Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book in which there is no doubt. And he said, I was shocked that usually when a writer writes a book, in their introduction, in their forward, in their preface, they usually talk about the mistakes that they've made, and they apologize to the reader that I'm sorry for any mistakes in my translation or in my making of this book. But this author is so confident about his ability, he says this is the book in which there is no doubt. And this person became Muslim just by reading ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. So coming back to Imam Al-Dhahabi, he mentions that certain reasons for why this story could be a fabrication. and his conclusion is that this story is in fact a fabrication. He mentions that Abu Bakr was a couple of years younger than the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a young boy at the age of 11 or 12, then Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would have been 9 or 10 years old. And he would have been very young to go on a trade journey to Syria. And then we have the issue regarding Bilal radiallahu an. Bilal radiallahu an was much younger than Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He wasn't even born at the time. And he was not acquired by Abu Bakr radiallahu an until after the migration to Medina. So these are some of the questions that start arising in the mind of Imam al-Dhahabi. And then he mentions that in the story, it's mentioned that the cloud is sheltering the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then the tree is sheltering the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So how come the tree is sheltering the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam when the cloud is already a shelter for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And then he goes on further and he says, why did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam not go to Abu Talib when he became a prophet and remind Abu Talib of this incident that took place? That do you not remember that we were on a trade journey to Syria and we met Bahira the monk and he said to you that I'm going to be a prophet of Allah? So when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was giving the da'wah to his uncle Abu Talib, why did he not mention this then to Abu Talib? And even further, when he received the revelation in the cave of Ghari Hira, he didn't know what he was happening to him, and he ran back home to his wife Khadija, and he said, "Dhammiluni, dhammiluni, cover me, cover me." He didn't know what was happening, and then she took him to Waraq bin Nawfal, and they asked Waraq bin Nawfal that who was this person that came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Waraq said, "This is the angel Jibra'il. This is Namus. This is the same angel that came to Musa and Isa." So here, Waraq bin Nawfal is explaining who this angel is who brought the revelation. If the Prophet sallallahu to Syria and on the way he met Bahira the monk, then he could have said to the angel Jibreel that I've been waiting for you for over a period of 30 years. So these are some of the things that I've mentioned, and some scholars they say maybe the Abu Bakr Siddiq and Bilal is not correct, but the rest of the story, but this is part of the same story. You can't just pick and choose you don't want to accept. And also another point, non-Muslims, the historians, the researchers, they have found this as the missing story. So this is the point where they say, this is where he acquired all of his information about the Jews and the Christians. Because realize there was no information about Christians and Jews in Mecca. The Jews and the Christians were not living in Mecca. There were Jews and Christians in Medina. There was no Old Testament. There were no libraries. There were no universities at that time in Mecca. There was no scripture in Mecca. So the Arabs did not record the stories of Yusuf alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, the stories of the Bani Israel, because they were not relevant to the Arabian culture at the time. So the Quraysh, they don't have anything to do with the Bani Israel. And the Bani Israel are lost to them. So the historians, the Orientalists to this day, they don't have an answer to this. And they say, they're surprised that in the middle of a Jahili society, the Prophet ﷺ, he comes and he starts to recite the histories of the people who are not his own. There was no information, there was no technology, no internet, no WhatsApp. The Prophet ﷺ himself is illiterate. So how did the Prophet ﷺ come to know in great detail about the stories of the Bani Israel, Musa alayhi salam, Yusuf alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in the Quran. وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. That, and you did not recite before it any scripture, nor did you inscribe one with your right hand. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that you did not recite any scripture before. You did not write anything with your own hand. And further in Surah Hud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تِلْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الْغَيْبِ نُوحِيهَا إِلَيْكَ مَا كُنْتَ تَعْلَمُهَا أَنْتَ وَلَا قَوْمُكَ مِنْ قَبْلِ هَذَا. That this is from the news of the unseen which we have revealed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You knew it not, neither did your people know this before you. So be patient indeed. the best of outcomes is for the righteous. So this is where some of the Orientalists, they say that this is where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam must have got this information from. But actually this is quite ludicrous, because if you think logically, right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was 11 or 12 years old at the time. And during this one meeting with the monk, Bahira the monk, he learns about this great encyclopedia about the detailed story of Yusuf alayhi salam, the detailed story of Musa alayhi salam, the detailed story of Ishaq and Isa alayhi salam. How in this short time, in this one meal that they had, is he supposed to learn all of this story? And then when he becomes at the age of 40 and he claims to be a prophet, he talks about this in great detail. So this doesn't really make much sense. So Al-Dhahabi, in conclusion, he says that I feel this story is fabricated, and this is why sometimes when we study the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can't always take something at face value, because there were many people who wanted to fabricate lies about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, there was one person at the time of Imam Ahmad. He fabricated a famous hadith about Fadail of Quran. So he made up a hadith about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a fabricated hadith about every surah in the Quran. If you read Baqarah, there's this reward for it. If you read Surah Nisa and Surah Muzammil and all of the surahs of the Quran, you get this virtue, you get this virtue, you get this virtue. In the end, when they came to him and they confronted him, Imam Ahmad said, how can you do such a thing? You know what his response was? That, I thought the people now, they're becoming busy in fiqh and history, and they're leaving off reading the Quran. So I made this up to try and, in an attempt to get them back to reading the Quran. So it's just, he had a good intention to try and make people come back to the Quran. But what did he do? In fact, he fabricated a saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the process. So inshallah, this brings us to the end of our seerah lesson for today. Inshallah, in the next session we'll talk a bit about Hilf al-Fudul, and also known as Hilf al-Mutayyibin. Barakallahu fiqh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.